In this demo, I'm going to be using the Blickrylic glass medium. I've also done this with the golden satin glazing liquid. I began my painting using the Grisaille technique. I used Blickrylic, titanium white, and Mars black. I will be using Blickrylic fire red, chrome yellow, and ultramarine blue. This is my glass medium. It's important to know the difference between the glass medium and titanium white. Sometimes looking in the bottle, they look very similar. So make sure that you know which is your glass medium when you make your palette. When you make your palette for glazing, I recommend having all of your acrylic paints on one palette and then having another palette with your glass medium or whatever glazing medium you are using, and then mixing your glaze mixtures on one palette and keeping these pigments the pure paint. That way you don't get confused between what you have added your medium to and what is the pure pigment. I like to glaze with a ratio of about 10 parts of medium to 1 part paint. This is my glass medium. I labeled it so that I won't get confused with my white paint. I am going to scoop up some of my glass medium and put it in another area of my palette, and then I'm going to consider that my 10 parts of glass medium, and then I'm just going to use a little bit of red paint. So you can see this is about the ratio I'm working with. 10 parts glass medium to 1 part of my acrylic paint. Then I'm going to mix these together. Since my medium is kind of opaque in liquid form, your paint might look a little bit of like a tint. So my red plus my medium is looking a little bit like a tint of red, like pinkish, but that's okay. Your glass medium is going to dry transparent. So once I have this mixed up, I'm going to apply a thin coat onto my entire apple. The point of glazing is to build up a lot of thin layers so that way you're seeing the underpainting through the transparency of your glass medium. You might lose some of your highlights. That's okay, we can kind of bring those back out later. I'm also going to mix up some yellow orange to add into my highlights and some violet and blue violet to add into my shadow. I like to begin glazing with a 10:1 ratio so that it starts fairly transparent. You can always adjust your ratio to have your paint be more opaque. You would do this by using less glass medium and more paint. So a 5:1 ratio, 5 parts glass medium to 1 part of acrylic paint would increase the opacity. If I needed more transparency, I could add even more glass medium. You can always layer to get more opaque layers, but you can't go the other way. So you want to start thin and then continue to build up your layers. I want this process to be very smooth and even, so don't kind of have thick amounts of paint. We want this all to be very, very thin and even, so that way when you're finished you have a nice smooth surface, creating that illusion of depth. Notice how I'm also curving around the form. So my brush strokes are curving around this edge, and then I'm going more vertical in the middle, and then I'm curving around this direction on the left side. This process doesn't really require a lot of paint. Make sure that if you're rinsing your brush, you're not adding water, but you're letting the glass medium add to the fluidity of your paint. I'm going to create another mixture with more paint and less glass medium. Next, I'm going to start developing my core shadow. I'm going to be using my red violet and my blue violet in this area. I've already mixed up my colors, but I need to make my ratio for glazing. If your paint is feeling a little bit tacky, let the previous coat dry, then add your next layer on top. You want to either mix when both are fairly wet and fluid, or wait for it to dry and then add your next layer. Otherwise, you might get a lot of a tacky surface, which can create kind of a texture. I added my core shadow in this area here, and also in the area where the stem is going into the apple to create the illusion of depth. Next, I'm going to go in and continue building my mixture using my red and my yellow orange with a little bit more paint and a little bit less medium. This is a little bit tacky, so I'm going to add more glass medium to try to thin that out a little bit. For these layers, I'm using about a 1:1 ratio. Rather than painting with the full 1/4 inch of the toe of this brush, I'm using it on the edge. Using the side of the brush will help create more precise lines that I'm adding for the kind of variation that occurs in the coloring of the apple. This is feeling a little bit tacky. I'm going to let this dry. While it's drying, I'm going to work on the background and the foreground. I've made similar studies of this, so I want to be consistent with those backgrounds. So I'm going to be using a ultramarine for the foreground and a yellow ochre for the background. To make a yellow ochre with your primaries, use a little bit of chrome yellow plus a little bit of violet. I also added a tiny bit of orange into this to warm it up a little bit more. For this, I'm using about my 10:1 ratio, and you can really see on this the transparency of the glaze mixture. And you can just glaze right over the stem because we will be covering that. If you want it to be really consistent, you can go ahead and kind of glaze over the entire stem with your yellow. I'm going to add more ultramarine blue into this mixture since it is so transparent. I'm still going to go back and add a little bit more paint to this mixture to make it more opaque. I also want to go back and adjust this. Looking at my other sample, my other mixture is much more of a yellow ochre with more of a dull yellow and a little bit of an orange, so I'm going to adjust that as well. Next, I'm going to go back and add a little bit of blue violet into my cast shadow. I have a little bit of my gloss medium, but I don't need a whole lot. I know I need this area to be fairly opaque where it's the darkest, right where the apple is sitting on the surface of the table. I'm continuing to refine my apple with additions of highlights and shadows, as well as the variations of color. Mix up a red violet and again use the side of the brush to go back in and add some more of these details. This is pure paint. I don't have any of my gloss medium in this mixture. I want to make sure that these aren't raised, so I'm going to go back and make them more subtle and flatten out any of those kind of raised or thicker areas of paint. I'm feeling pretty good about this. I'm going to continue to add a little bit of my red, and this was kind of my mixture that I added more paint to, so it ended up being kind of like a 5:1 ratio. Looking at this, I still want some darker areas in my core shadow. I'm going to add my blue violet into this area with less gloss medium. Next, I'm going to develop this stem by making a brown using orange and blue and then my gloss medium. And I added a little bit of red in this mixture to warm it up. I applied this over the entire stem. I'm going to make the right side of the stem a little bit duller with some violet. And next, we are ready to bring out our highlights. When you add your transparent layers, you lose a lot of your highlights, so you will need to go back with white, and we want to bring out our highlight, which was initially here, and we also want to bring out our highlight that was here. I'm using titanium white for my highlights. I'm still going to add a little bit of gloss medium into the white in order for the paint to be more fluid so I can get it to blend a little bit more easily. Notice how I'm using the toe of my brush to cut in on this edge and then bring the paint downward. I'm also using the side of the brush to pick up some of these more subtle highlights on the sides. If you feel like you overdid it, rinse your brush and kind of go back and make that area more subtle. And I'm really not loving what happened here, so I'm going to go back with some of my red and kind of try to fill in that area a little bit more before I add my white highlight on it again. So don't be afraid of kind of feeling like you're overdoing it, because we can always go back with our red gloss mixture to kind of knock this back a little bit. We're going to let this dry before we add our red gloss mixture. While that's drying, go back and add a little bit more of your yellow and yellow-orange. You do want to build up your layers, going from a higher amount of gloss medium to a lower amount. So that's why I'm starting with my 10:1 ratio, and then I'm building up my layers and using less medium. I still want this highlight to be more subtle, so I'm going back and trying to kind of thin it down. I'm adding another layer to my foreground. I wanted to get a little bit more coverage where it was kind of thin, and I also added a little bit of my fire red into my ultramarine blue to create a blue violet. The blue violet fits in better with the color tonality. It also helps knock back the cast shadow and fits in better with this background color. I feel like I could keep fussing with this for a long time, but I'm going to call this done. I will say that personally I enjoy using the Satin Glazing liquid a little bit more because it is thinner. The glass medium is thicker, so sometimes it does get a little bit tacky or harder to blend. Also, I encourage you to think about which primary colors you personally enjoy using. We again used fire red, ultramarine blue, and chrome yellow. Sometimes those particular pigments as primaries get a little bit muddy when you mix them together to make greens and violets. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this piece going from my Grisaille Underpainting to my glazed finished study. Using an underpainting such as a Grisaille or an Imprimatura develops the value structure so that when you're ready to glaze, you don't have to think so much about using the tints, shades, and tones of your main hue. You use the established underpainting to provide kind of a foundation. Layering the thin coats of your transparent hue allows the underpainting to show through and also help you develop the form with color. For this one I used the Golden Satin Glazing Liquid or the Acrylic Glazing Liquid. I also used the Golden Fluid acrylic paints. This acrylic glazing liquid is the same as the satin glazing liquid. It's just been repackaged. The satin glazing liquid is matte. It has matting agents such as white silica and diatomaceous earth. It does give a satin finish rather than the gloss medium, which obviously gives the gloss finish. The difference is that on this left image, I began with an Imprimatura painting. I used the exact same ratios of mixtures on this one as I did on this one. I used yellow ochre, burnt umber, and titanium white. I used Golden Brand for those. On this right side, I began with a Grisaille painting. I used titanium white and Mars black. This was with Liquitex brand. The glazing, however, is exactly the same, and I found this really interesting to see how the warm hue on the left side really showed through and created kind of a different effect than the grayscale or the Grisaille painting on the right side. Image on the left with the Imprimatura painting is warmer, obviously, and the image on the right with the Grisaille painting is cooler.